Yeah, thank you for the song this morning. We'll be returning to Isaiah. We're going to Isaiah 49. In our series through the book of Isaiah, this is now message number 60, entitled Sing for the Servant. And we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 to 13. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from far. The Lord hath called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver hath he hid me. And said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Then I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught, and in vain. Yet surely my judgment is with the Lord, and my work with my God. And now saith the Lord that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him, though Israel be not gathered. Yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength. And he said, It is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. So chapters 40 to 48 are the opening section of part 2 of Isaiah. And this section focuses on the future exile and return from that exile. That section mentions Cyrus by name and also refers to him in other places where he's not named, and mentions him as God's servant to essentially conquer and defeat Babylon and to decree the return, to build the wall of Jerusalem and lay the foundation for the second temple. And one of the things that we noted is how that Isaiah uses messianic language applied to Cyrus, which is somewhat surprising. Maybe perhaps the only instance of that being applied to some sort of a Gentile. But in one place, he's called anointed, the very word from which we get Messiah. He's referred to as conquering nations, releasing captives, rebuilding Jerusalem. But there's also some stark differences that's very non-messianic. For instance, Cyrus doesn't suffer as a part of his calling. Cyrus didn't know God. Israel only returned partially, and Israel also remained sinful. And Cyrus's kingdom, well, that kingdom ultimately fell to the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great. So Cyrus was not the ultimate servant to truly gather and restore Israel. He was a servant. He was an instrument that God used to accomplish a purpose. But Cyrus's failures ultimately show us the need for a greater servant. It's similar to the way how that Adam's failure showed the need for a greater Adam. David's failure showed the need for a greater David, and so on. That is certainly something that we see patterned throughout the Bible. Well, chapter 48 that we looked at last time capped off this opening section of part 2. And there were reasons there that were given for the exile. Obviously, the persistent sin of rejecting God's word is really sort of at the root of it. But deliverance was also prophesied, meaning that the exile, though long, the exile is purposeful, and the exile is also temporary. Now, the greater servant of Yahweh was already introduced back in chapter 42. But chapters 49 to 57, which is the next section in part 2 of Isaiah, reveals this servant in his calling, in his cancellation, and in his completion. This section has 3 remaining servant songs. We've already looked at the first in chapter 42. So here in chapter 49, verses 1 to 13, what we're looking at this morning, this is the second servant song. The third is chapter 50, verses 4 to 11. And the fourth is chapter 52, verse 12 through chapter 53 and verse 12. Now, this particular section gives the most compressed description of Messiah's suffering and glory, which ultimately means two advents of Christ. And chapter 49 that we're looking at, if we look at the chapter as a whole, there are three particular movements in this chapter. We have the servant song in verses 1 to 13. We have Zion's complaint in verses 14 to 21. And in verses 22 to 26, we see the nation saved and also destroyed. Well, this chapter highlights two apparent failures in God's plan to redeem Israel. The first of those having to do with the servant, the second of those having to do with the exile. So we are looking at verses 1 to 13, this second servant song. And this describes the apparent failure of the servant, but it reinforces his calling and completion of that calling, and ends, in fact, with a call to sing the new song because the servant accomplished his mission. So we'll look at this servant song in three parts. So verses 1 to 4, where it presents us or causes us to ask the question, has the servant failed? In verses 5 to 7, which is the center of this song, everything sort of revolves around it, we're going to get a clear statement of the servant's purpose, his calling and his commission of his servant, the Messiah. And verses 8 to 13, then we get a view of the servant's victory, which ends with singing of the new song. So let's start in verses 1 to 4, where we ask, has the servant failed? Verse number 1, listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from far. The Lord hath called me from the womb, from the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. So the isles and the people, we've seen this reference before. People is actually plural. It should be people. Some of the newer translations have peoples. It is the word for leomim, which is not as common of a word for nation, but it is one of the words for nations that is used in the Old Testament, and we've looked at those several times. And the isles referring to those coastlands. In other words, it's descriptive, sort of speaking of the nations to the ends of the earth, sort of address. And again, this is a servant song, and it is written and constructed somewhat poetically. So the servant himself. So this is the servant of Yahweh. This is the Messiah. He is speaking in this opening part, and he's calling on all the nations to hear, essentially sending his word, his voice to the ends of the earth, because his mission has to do with them as well as with Israel. Now, a lot of this song is going to be taken up with Israel and his relation to Israel and his mission towards Israel. A lot of this song is going to emphasize that, is going to focus on that. But as we continue seeing here and even later in this chapter, his mission to the nations is also present. And so that's how this servant song begins. And notice the references here. The Lord hath called me from the womb, and from the bowels of my mother made mention of my name. So the servant Messiah will be born of a woman, which obviously anticipated back in chapter 7 and verse number 14. Emmanuel being born of a virgin, and being called a name, or being called by name, or being named, as it indicates, is something that refers to purpose. So this has not been some general call that has gone out to say, well, who's going to save, who's going to stand up and save Israel, who's going to stand up and deliver. But no, he's named for this particular purpose. So the servant is ordained to this particular purpose. Now, starting in verse number 2, it says, and he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver hath he hid me. So this verse has two significant images, the sharp sword and the sharp arrow, which is the indication of the polished shaft, the sharp arrow. The sharp sword and the sharp arrow. And then it also has a refrain that is repeated twice. He hath hid me, or hath he hid me. Now this is a part that makes us think of Psalms and makes us think of Hebrew poetry more specifically. So first of all, his mouth is like a sharp sword. Now the sharp sword speaks particularly of authority, and it speaks of authority as legislative authority. In other words, his authority to decree, and that decree cannot be resisted, and judicial authority, his authority to judge, his authority to render a verdict, and that verdict is not reversible. Now, this began actually, this picture and this imagery associated with the Messiah began all the way back in chapter 11 and verse number 4 in reference to the Davidic king who will rule there with the rod of his mouth and the breath of his lips. Now, this image of his mouth as a sharp sword is obviously realized in Christ. In fact, in Revelation chapter 1 and verse number 6, as the revelation opens, he that out of his mouth is the sharp two-edged sword, repeated in chapter 2 in verses 12 and 16. And then again, we see this in action in Revelation chapter 19, in the second coming, when Christ comes again to the earth to destroy his enemies. He has that sharp two-edged sword that proceeds from his mouth. And so these are all of this imagery that is going together. And what this refers to, his mouth has been made a sharp sword. It means that his decrees are irresistible and his verdicts are irreversible. The power of his word by which he will conquer, destroy, by which he will rule, by which he will bring life. Well, having this power in his word also reveals the servant's divinity. He is God. We go all the way back to Genesis 1 when God spoke and created. Psalm 33 and verse 6 talks about how that God created the worlds with his words. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 17 speaks of the word of God as the sword of the Spirit. And that's similar in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse number 12. The power of this word. Well, that is the power that the servant has. He has divine power. In other words, he is, in other places, the Messiah is pictured as a lawgiver as well as a judge. And so this imagery goes right along with that. And the sword indicates that it can't be overcome, that he has power to deliver and he has power to destroy. Now, then we get the first refrain, hath he hid me, which gets repeated after the next statement, this refrain. Being hid with God refers to the Father sending him forth at the precise time. So his mouth is made a sharp sword, but he's hidden. He's not immediately revealed. He's made a sharp arrow, but he's hidden in the quiver. He's not immediately deployed. And so this is what Paul refers to later as the fullness of time. Galatians 4:4, speaking of his first advent, that in the fullness of time, at that appropriate time, that he came forth born of a woman. And then in Ephesians 1:10 that we looked at not too awful long ago in our Wednesday night studies, that in the fullness of time, God is going to gather everything together under him. In other words, he's going to reign in his second advent. So this is what this hiding refers to. And then the polished shaft or the sharp arrow that is being referred to is kept in the quiver. A sharp arrow is a tool, an instrument, a weapon, and in the hands of a master marksman, it is a high precision instrument. So a sharp arrow is not a scatter shot. It is rather a precise single shot that is aimed at a single target, which again speaks of the purpose of the servant. That purpose, that aim of the servant. We go on, verse 3. And said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Now, the Messiah is here addressed as Israel, as the representative of Israel. He is of Israel, and he is for the salvation of Israel. And God is glorified in him and in the redemption of Israel as we continue reading. Verse 4, then I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught, and in vain, yet surely my judgment is with the Lord and my work with my God. So in his first coming, he met with rejection in Israel. He met with humiliation. He met with death, in fact, as he was murdered upon a cross because he was rejected. So this refers to his humiliation, that it looks like that he labored in vain and that he spent his strength in vain. He did not fully accomplish what the servant was supposed to accomplish in his first coming. But then he has this reflection. Judgment, again, refers to a verdict. And he's saying that that's ultimately in God's hands. So, in other words, what might look like an apparent failure is not a failure because it's just not complete yet. Actually, it was a success. He accomplished everything that his first advent was supposed to accomplish. And we know that from the fuller picture and story of Scripture. He accomplished everything that the first advent was supposed to accomplish. And the second advent necessarily and inevitably, he will fulfill the rest of this picture. So in other words, it's not up to the judgment of man. Did the Messiah succeed, or did the servant succeed, or did the servant fail? Now we go to the next part, and this is the center of the song, and it's the center of the song theologically and thematically and in terms of its meaning. This is the real core of this servant song. So verse number 5. And now saith the Lord that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him, though Israel be not gathered, yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength. So he speaks here of his purpose. And he goes back, the Lord that formed me from the womb. And we've talked about Isaiah, particularly how he uses this language, creation language, of being created, of being made, and of being formed. Being formed is, again, language that is used to speak of like a potter forming a vessel upon a wheel. It's made for a purpose. It's made as a bowl. If what you want is a bowl, then a plate doesn't really do. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of trying to eat soup on a plate. I actually have once, and no, it doesn't work real well. That's not the purpose. So this word speaks of purpose. So he has a purpose in calling and naming his servant, and that purpose is that he is sent to that purpose from the womb to be a servant, to bring Jacob again to him. So despite what appears to be failure, because in a way you could say Israel is in worse condition after the Messiah came than before he came, as they are scattered in long exile. But despite the apparent failure, his purpose is to bring Jacob again, is to gather Israel, just as Moses prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 7. And he will be glorified in accomplishing his work, even though that has not happened yet. Verse number 6. And he said, it is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the end of the earth. Raising up and restoring Jacob, referring to the remnant of Israel, is not all of the work. And he says it's a light thing. In other words, that's too small. His purpose is not just to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore that preserve. So the word for tribes there is the normal word for tribes. The preserved means something kept or hidden. So this is the remnant of Israel kept that he's referring to. that by itself is too small. That's not all of God's purpose in the servant's work. He says, I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. So he is also for the salvation of the nations. And this is the plural goyim that is being used here, also added to the description, to the ends of the earth. All the nations upon the ends of the earth. Now, Paul recognized that Israel's blindness happened during this time of exile. And he knew that it would be taken away by God. And he recognized that this age is the times of the nations, the times of the Gentiles as it's rendered, but times of the nations, the age of the nations. This is the time during their exile when Israel remains for the most part in unbelief. Verse number 7, thus saith the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel and his Holy One, to him whom man despiseth, to him whom the nation abhorreth, to a servant of rulers, kings shall see and arise, princes also shall worship, because of the Lord that is faithful, and the Holy One of Israel, and he shall choose thee. Humiliation and rejection of the Messiah is not the final end of his work. It's not always going to be or to appear that way. Now, he does use nation here, abhorred of whom the nation abhorreth. That is goy in the singular. And we've talked about this a number of times, that term goy is really the general term for nations. It doesn't mean Gentiles. It means nations. It's a general term for nations. Now, through usage, it began to be heavily applied toward non-Jewish nations. And that has carried over into translations and such. But it's the general term for nations. It's a term that encompasses a common ethnicity, a language, a culture, having territorial possession, self-government. This is how the Bible defines a nation. So Israel is referred to as a goy at different times, and that's for different reasons. And sometimes it's just a general reference. Sometimes it's a reference to their unbelieving state, and so on. But we see, like, if you look at like Exodus chapter 33 and verse number 13, you'll see goy and both used in there where Moses makes that statement, this nation is your people. Both of them used, applied to Israel. So again, that's not a problem. We just have to recognize when it is used of Israel and understand what the meaning is. So in his first advent, he did not resist or oppose human rulers. We read those verses of how that he would not cry out and lift up his voice. He wouldn't try to raise up a resistance and all these sort of things. In his first advent, this didn't happen. But it tells us in the latter part of this verse, which is where the real turn is, in his second advent, he'll reign over all. Kings, rulers, will see, arise, princes will worship, will bow down before him. This will be by the faithfulness of God, because he will not leave nor forsake his promises. Now we get to the next part of this. This is the last part of this song, verses 8 to 13. And now we get a picture of the servant's victory. So we saw verses 5 to 7 that his mission was described, and now we see the turn from the humiliation toward the victory. Verse number 8. Thus saith the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee. And I will preserve thee and give thee for a covenant of the people to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. So the Messiah here has prayed and is heard in the day of salvation, is preserved, and we're told is given as a covenant for the people, for the nation. This he's given, and this is reference to the new covenant, the word for there in the singular, the nation. The reasons or the purposes that are accomplished through this covenant are three. Two of them in this verse and one in the next. We have, number one, restoration of the land. And number two, inheriting the inheritances that have been desolate, that have been forsaken. So establishing the earth refers to restoring the land. You see, the coming of the Messiah promises not only a gathering and a restoration of Israel, but a restoration of the land of Israel in particular, but as well as across the earth. We've already had numerous places in Isaiah where we get these descriptions of the kingdom and what conditions on the earth will be like in that kingdom, which is a entirely distinct from what we know now, and really even what we have known since the fall in the garden. So a part of his purpose is the restoration of the land of the earth, and that the desolate or the abandoned or the barren inheritances, the land promised to the fathers of Israel, will be possessed. Now we go in verse 9, that thou mayest say to the prisoners, go forth; to them that are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall feed in the ways, and their pastures shall be in all high places. So continuing on from this previous verse, we get this third purpose that is accomplished through this covenant. He's a covenant of the people who restores the land, that he may loose the prisoners and bring light to the blind. In other words, to lead Israel in a new exodus. So despite Israel's current condition, they shall be brought to peace and to plenty. And so we get a reversal as well as a restoration in this passage. Verse number 10, they shall not hunger nor thirst, neither shall the heat nor sun smite them. For he that hath mercy on them shall lead them, even by the springs of water shall he guide them. So we are being told then that they will at that time dwell in safety. Of course, this goes all the way back to the Davidic covenant as well, when God promised to David with covenant to him that Israel would be gathered, they would be united, and they would be at peace and have rest from their enemies. And so we're getting descriptive terms used in relation to that time. We're getting also imagery that's not explicit, but also it's imagery of shepherding. The servant here as shepherd, that he's going to lead them out. They're not going to hunger. They're not going to thirst, and they'll have rest, and all of these sort of things. Verse number 11, and I will make all my mountains a way, and my highway shall be exalted. In other words, nothing will hinder. Nothing will stand in the way. Nothing will prevent this gathering and this restoration. Verse 12, behold, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north and from the west and from the land of Sinim. Now, Israel will be gathered from among all nations, and so we get references from afar, from the north and from the west, and even from Sinim. Sinim, as I understand it, was an ancient name for part of the region today that we know as China. So it was the furthest eastern extent of the known world to them in that time. They're in the Middle Eastern region. So overall, it's quite poetic expression. But it's saying that Israel shall be gathered from the farthest extents of the earth. So no matter how far from Jerusalem geographically that those of Israel have been scattered to, no matter how far away that they may be, no matter how obscure that the place may be, they will be gathered from all ends of the earth. And we get references to this in other prophecies as well. So they shall be gathered. There's no place too far. And then we end on verse number 13. Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains. For the Lord hath comforted his people, and will have mercy upon his afflicted. So when these things come to pass, when the servant has this victory. He is vindicated. He was humiliated and suffered and was rejected earlier, but then the turn comes, and now we see him in his full victory. And when this happens, there's a call to sing praise. We've encountered this a number of times in the Psalms. We've encountered it in Isaiah. We've talked about this a number of times, but this is a reference to the singing of the new song. It's praise of the Messiah in his kingdom, because he has come, because he has restored the earth, because he has gathered Israel and restored them, and because he has established his kingdom and he rules from Jerusalem. So this is the new song that's associated with the second coming of Christ and that establishment of his kingdom. Of course, this is very descriptive language, and we've talked about this, very high imagery, the earth itself singing, the heavens singing, mountains singing. In other places we get things like trees clapping their hands and singing. We've talked about that sort of imagery before, but what it speaks to is the restoration of the very creation that will affect even the plant and animal life on the earth. And so the way that Paul puts it in Romans chapter number 8 is that this creation, and he makes a distinction there between mankind and the creation, and he says that this creation groans and it travails in pain, language associated with childbirth. It groans and travails, and he says it's in bondage. This creation, speaking of the earth, and again, the plants and the animals and the earth, this creation is in bondage, and it's been subjected to bondage because of the curse of sin. But what does he say? He says, awaiting that day of liberty, when the sons of God are manifest, awaiting that day when they will be freed. And so when we get this sort of high imagery that speaks of trees clapping their hands and mountains singing for joy and, and all these sort of things, it's descriptive of that time when the earth is going to sort of burst forth in freedom from this captivity of the curse to restoration. So as we think about this song and we think about Israel's plight, and we will get to the next part of this chapter where we encounter some of Israel's complaints, it's not hard for us to feel the distress of the faithful in exile, especially when things don't seem to be going according to plan. And we can feed ourselves today on that constant news cycle that just leaves us anxious and angry and addled, because there's so many things to worry about. There's so many things to fear. There's so many things that are distressing. The real comforting news about that is that what we're aware of that's so distressing and frightening and all of this, what we're aware of is just a little drop in the bucket of all the things that we could be worried about. It's just a very small part of the picture. We don't even know the depths and extents of all of that. But we also today have a blessed benefit. We read Isaiah and we know the history that has unfolded since it was written. And so when God tells us beforehand how this story goes, we shouldn't be shocked when we are living in the middle of it, because we are. We are. These verses that we're reading, this song of the servant that we're reading about, it doesn't just apply to Israel 2,000 years ago. It speaks further. It reaches further. It looks forward to things that have not even happened yet. The earth hasn't been restored yet. The new song hasn't been sung yet. And it won't be until the Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom. So we are living in this time. It's a time of exile still for Israel. But when we really grasp God's revelation in his word, then it stabilizes us. We realize that even though across our lifetimes we see very distressing things that are concerning and alarming, things that are fearful. We see very, very many distressing things, but what do we know? What do we know from the Bible? We know that we're not adrift in history. We're on course. Just because we don't know what this part of the path looks like exactly, we are on course. Present circumstances are not what predicts and determines the future. God does, because he wrote it, and he will see to it that it comes about. So again, this is not just a comforting word to Israel. It's a comforting word even to us today, because there are still yet these things to be accomplished. The servant is still yet to come forth the second time. All right, we will stop here, and we will close with a hymn.